Chinese President Hu Jintao's recent visit to the United States is seen as the most important state visit in decades. What has been achieved so far? And what are the long-term consequences of Hu's visit? How will better relations of the two sides develop? Today, we are going to have a cup of tea with CCTV current affairs commentator Tengjimeng. He is also a professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Hello, Professor Teng. Welcome to our Tea House program.
Thank you, Yang Yang, for inviting me over to drink this great tea at the Laoshe Tea House.
My pleasure. It's been widely believed that Hu Jintao's visit to the United States is the cornerstone for China-US relations. What do you think are the major results of his visit?
I think there are great results and great outcome that comes out from this visit and this state visit by President Hu. I think first thing first, this is a state visit that sets the tone for bilateral relations in the next decade of the 21st century. And this includes how we are going to, in a sense, communicate and consult each other on major issues of our bilateral concern. And also at the same time, this state visit will help to stabilize our two countries' relations, because we have been experiencing twists and turns in the past year. For example, in 2010, this is a very, very kind of a rocky year for both China and the United States. We have been disputed over each other over issues such as trade policy, currency policy, human rights, President Obama's meeting with Dalai Lama, and many other issues. So it's going to be a very, very important page in the history of our two nations.
Strategic interests seem to be less on the level as opposed to economic ones. Why?
Well, I think one of the most important things that joined our two countries are trade and economic ties. Our two countries have enjoyed tremendous kind of benefits because of the economic relations and because of the trade and other exchanges and communications. But strategic issues remained an issue that we are going to discuss and we might dispute in the next decade. For example, China's sovereignty and China's kind of a claim on the oceanic territories in the South China Sea and also in the East China Sea. Both these issues remained very important and remained our core interest. I think the United States should take into consideration of these core interests that China proposed.
Where is the economic situation headed when it comes to the issue of yuan?
Well, the yuan issue remained a very, very important concern, I think, for both China and also the United States. I think China actually at the time is suffering the kind of inflation, but once again, the Chinese government is very confident, very capable that we can stabilize this current economic situation. We have actually come up with lots of different measures, including administrative measures, laws and regulation to keep that very inflation under control. And so yuan is not an issue for China, whereas for the United States, there are many voices in the States saying that yuan is an issue that keep the United States in a very inferior situation. For example, the large trade deficit. But I don't think that the yuan issue is the root cause for the United States kind of trade imbalances. I think the United States have to do a lot of homework in terms of examining the structure and restructuring their economy.
The yuan is reaching new levels comparative to the US dollar. How is Washington dealing with that? Thanks.
Well, I think Washington should welcome this move. By far, Chinese yuan had actually risen by 25%. And that's a huge and that's a dramatic rise in terms of a nation's currency being reevaluated at this point. I think China should not, in a sense, kowtow to certain demand by a foreign or by a trading partner. If we look back to the 1980s, you can see that Japan really bowed to the US call for the reevaluation of the Japanese yen, and then which was actually eventually signed into a kind of accord, which is the Plaza Accord. And that very accord actually eventually plunged the Japanese economy into a recession, and that recession even lasts until today. And so China should learn a great lesson from that very Plaza Accord. And so in this sense, I think China should stick to this kind of gradualist appreciation of yuan instead of a kind of dramatic or a revolutionary rise of yuan. Otherwise, it would do harm to both of our countries' economy.
And the Chinese government is trying to use a softer power approach to dealing with the US. Is that working?
I think yes, it is working. It is kind of working in a very fine and a very kind of interesting way. If you look at these two interesting films, or these TV advertisement being now running in the United States, in New York City, for example, that was a very friendly film that conveys a very interesting message. And that message actually is a message of friendliness, it's a message of harmony, it's a message of people-to-people relationship. And at the same time, it is also, for the first time, I think that China is now exposing itself to the world, not just through the kind of official diplomacy, but through this kind of very friendly and very people-friendly and the kind of very grassroots level PR tactics. And in this sense, I think it is easy for China to reach out, and it's easy for China to be, in a sense, absorbed and appreciated by people at the grassroots level.
Well, how much will Hu Jintao's trip will actually create a better relationship between the two nations?
Like President Hu said, his state visit is meant to, in a sense, better relations between China and the United States. And three words actually better summarize this very, very great trip, and that is to continue to build a cooperative, a comprehensive, and also a positive relations between China and the United States. And China actually, and President Hu, most specifically on this trip, has done a great deal in terms of building this very better relationship. And that is, we will focus on trade and economic relations, and we will continue to communicate with the legislatures in the legislative bodies of each of our two countries. At the same time, we also strengthen our military ties. Secretary Gates' visit to China paved the great way for better military ties. And lastly, but not least, I think it is also about President Hu bringing this very friendly message, and that is a people-to-people relationship, which is also important in terms of a comprehensive relationship.
Thank you very much, Professor Teng. Please enjoy a cup of tea. Looking back, we may see China-US relations as developing stably, yet not always smoothly. Now, let's review some major events in China-US relations from 1979 to 2010.
The present Sino-American relations have been described by academics and top leaders as the world's most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century. Looking back, we could summarize the Sino-US ties as developing stably, but not always smoothly. The following are the major events in Sino-US relations from 1979 to 2011. On January 1, 1979, China and the United States officially established diplomatic ties, marking a turning point in their bilateral relations. From then on, exchanges and cooperation between the two countries have been growing continually. In the same year, Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping and his wife paid an official visit to the United States at the invitation of US President Jimmy Carter. In July 1985, Chinese President Li Xiannian visited the US. This was the first visit to the United States by a Chinese head of state. In April 2006, Chinese President Hu Jintao visited the US. In Washington, he and President George W. Bush stressed the importance to reinforce cooperation between the two countries. On November 15, 2009, US President Barack Obama started his 4-day state visit of China. A China-US joint statement was issued during the visit, which reiterated the two sides' commitment to building a positive, cooperative, and comprehensive relationship in the 21st century and taking concrete actions to build partnership to jointly cope with common challenges. However, looking back, relations between China and the United States have been tested. In January 2010, China decided to suspend scheduled visits between the Chinese and American armed forces. This was in response to Washington's plan to sell an arms package worth about $6.4 billion to Taiwan. In March of 2010, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State James Steinberg and National Security Council's Senior Director for Asian Affairs Jeffrey Bader visited China and patched things up. Later that month, in a letter to the U.S. Secretary of Treasury and Commerce Secretary, 130 U.S. congressmen demanded that the Obama administration get tough with China over its currency practices. On March 22, 2010, Google closed Google.cn and relocated its server to Hong Kong. Things got better since China and the United States held the second round of strategic and economic dialogues last May in Beijing to discuss key issues including trade, investment, global economic recovery, and climate change. During last year's G20 summit in Toronto and Seoul, President Hu Jintao met with US President Barack Obama. Earlier this month, when Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi visited the US, he discussed with President Obama issues on bilateral relations. He also made preparations for a state visit to the United States later this month by Chinese President Hu Jintao. On January 9th of this year, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates started a 3-day visit to China. China and the United States agreed to avoid misunderstandings in developing military ties. The past years have witnessed ups and downs in bilateral ties. Most analysts have characterized present Sino-US relations as complex and multifaceted. A positive and comprehensive Sino-US relationship is important to the international community.
It's 2011, Professor Tang. I'd like to look in detail at the historical significance of Hu Jintao's visit to the US. First, let's talk about foreign policy towards other Southeast Asian countries. We have seen the formation of US, Japan, and South Korea alliance in relation to the situation on Korean Peninsula. How will this affect China's relations with neighboring countries?
Well, I do not know whether that's an alliance in between Japan and South Korea. I think these two countries are kind of becoming closer, are kind of working closer and closer because of several issues. Because, for example, of the nuclear program of North Korea, the artillery shelling of Pyongyang Island, as well as China's dispute over Diaoyu Island with Japan. These countries are kind of working closely over some of these issues. But perceptions in terms of hostility has never been, in a sense, reached a consensus in between Japan and South Korea. And even if these two countries form that kind of alliance, it will not impact China and China's diplomacy that much. I think traditionally we are very much close to Korea, both Koreas, and also Japan, because Japan anyway, this is an Asian country, and even if he set up this kind of alliance with the United States, Japan remains an Asian country, and Japan should work closer and work on very friendly terms with China. And facts proved that even if there is kind of a military alliance, Japan remained almost China's most important trading partner, and China remained the most important trading partner with Japan, and our trading relations and economic relations with South Korea remains very healthy. That relationship remains intact, even if there are kind of military kind of disputes over some of these issues. And so I don't see the kind of concern in terms of China had to deal with these two neighbors in a very kind of serious way. I see a healthy direction towards which China can work together with South Korea and with Japan and plus the United States in order to resolve these issues on the Korean Peninsula. China had a stake. I mean, China had a great stake in the Korean Peninsula. For example, China is all for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and China is all for working closely and also friendly with our two neighbors. In a sense, it is a national policy in terms of working closely and be friendly neighbors to all these countries on our periphery.
I'd like to move on to the China-US relations. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made a speech mentioning the Americans' interests in the South China Sea. And China's stealth fighter, the J-20 jet, made its first test flight. How are these events related to the timing of Hu's visit?
Well, I don't think it influences the timing of President Hu's state visit, but I do see the US claim of the so-called core interest in the South China Sea a major concern on the Chinese part, because the South China Sea has been traditionally and historically, in a sense, our sphere of influence, and China has been playing a very good role in terms of guaranteeing the safe navigation, free international navigation, and also the peace and stability in general of this region. The US, and particularly with that speech made by Secretary Clinton, I think it is almost like a great interference into this region's affair, the region's kind of diplomatic situation. I think that the US should refrain from continue to interfere into this part of the world. We understand that America has an interest, and their concern is safe navigation, but China has never been a force disrupting free international navigation. In fact, we are a great peacemaker and great kind of peace defender in terms of this guaranteeing a free and peaceful and stable situation in the southern part of sea. China has always guaranteed that we will never resort to force in resolving the issue in this part of the world. And with J-20, China actually is a rising power. China is a rising military power, and our economic strength must go hand in hand with this very military strength. That's determined by our economic status. The growing military strength must be in line with our economic rise, because we have our overseas interest, and China's interests also need to be protected. And it is also a sign of China's rise as a high-tech power.
Thank you very much, Professor Teng. Please enjoy a cup of tea. "2011 marks the 40th anniversary of China-US resuming contact. How do you think the bilateral ties will continue to develop in the next decade?"
Well, I think the bilateral relations will continue to develop, and to develop in a very positive direction, and especially if we put that bilateral relations in the context of President Hu's state visit to the United States. President Hu had made very clear that China is meant to build this very trust, this mutual trust, and this very comprehensive and positive relations in the next decade. And so in this context, I would predict that China and the United States would, and this relationship would continue to develop in multiple fields. For example, in trade, in diplomacy, in military-to-military ties, and at the same time in terms of joining hands in resolving the post-financial crisis legacy. And so I would say, for example, China and the US would continue to cooperate in the areas such as climate change, in combating piracy on the high seas, in combating terrorism, and also in joining hands in dealing with the nuclear programs by North Korea, in the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, China and the United States can also work together in resolving the financial crisis, the kind of ripple effects as a result of the financial crisis that is felt in the United States and also in Europe.
What are the major issues that require more effort to deepen the relationship between the two countries in the next decade?
Right. I think several of these central core interest areas must be highlighted in terms of improving Sino-US relations. For China, I think the top concern is Taiwan, because this is the almost the permanent position that Taiwan is part of China, and Taiwan is a central core interest in Sino-American relations, and America should consider on our behalf this very central core issue. And at the same time, China will continue to require attention from the United States, in a sense, to seek a balance in between China, Japan, China, South Korea. China respects America's presence in this part of the world, in East Asia, and also its alliance with Japan and with South Korea. But that alliance should not be at the cost of China's interest. If that China's interest being taken care of, our two countries' relations will continue to develop and will not be rocked, like a boat out there in the chaotic sea. And so relations will depend on whether the US can handle this part of the relationship well. Whereas China, once again, I think China should also deal with America in a very balanced, in a kind of fair way. I'd say China, like President Hu had said on this trip, that China will continue to handle the foreign investment issue in a very fair and just manner. China will treat these foreign businesses and companies very fairly and try to provide level playing field for these foreign companies so that they can benefit from the Chinese markets.
Okay, thank you very much for joining our program, Professor Teng. Please enjoy a cup of tea. China-US relations are important, yet complex. The relationship has gone through many twists and turns, but a lot of people say it is heading in the right direction. Hu Jintao's state visit is seen as a great achievement to further developing the relationship of the two countries. We have a lot to expect in the next decade. Happy Spring Festival. I'm Yang Yang. See you next time.